The morning mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest on the 23rd of December, 1944, creating ghostly shadows between the snow-laden pines. Captain Friedrich Weber of the German Wehrmacht pressed his binoculars against his eyes, hardly believing what he was witnessing through the fog. Just 400 yards from his forward position, beyond the thin strip of no-man's land that separated the German lines from the American forces, stood what appeared to be a collection of canvas tents bearing the distinctive Red Cross marking of a medical facility. "This cannot be right," Weber muttered to his subordinate, Lieutenant Hans Becker, who crouched beside him in the frozen mud of their observation post. "Medical units should be miles behind the front lines. These Americans must be insane." Becker took the binoculars and peered through them, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Through the intermittent gaps in the mist, he could see figures in white medical coats moving between the tents with purposeful urgency. The unmistakable form of ambulances, their headlights painted over and moving slowly through the terrain, approached and departed from the facility in a steady stream. "They are performing surgery," Becker said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Right there. I can see the lights inside the operating tent. They are actually cutting people open within range of our artillery." What Captain Weber and Lieutenant Becker were observing was a phenomenon that would become one of the most remarkable aspects of American military medicine. During World War II, the forward placement of mobile army surgical hospitals, or what would later become known in another war by the acronym MASH units. But here, in the desperate winter of 1944, during what would come to be called the Battle of the Bulge, these medical units represented something the German military had never encountered before. The field hospital that had drawn the German officers' attention was the 45th Surgical Hospital, commanded by Major Robert Henderson, a surgeon from Chicago who had left a thriving practice to serve his country. Henderson stood inside the main surgical tent at that very moment, his hands deep inside the abdominal cavity of a 19-year-old private from Iowa who had taken shrapnel from a German 88mm shell just 2 hours earlier. "Clamp?" Henderson said calmly to the nurse beside him. Captain Mary Sullivan, a woman whose steady hands had already assisted in more than 300 surgeries since the hospital had landed in France 5 months earlier. The canvas walls of the tent shuddered as another artillery shell landed somewhere in the distance, close enough to rattle the surgical instruments but far enough to avoid direct impact. Nobody in the operating theatre flinched. They had all learned to distinguish between the sounds of incoming and outgoing fire, between the whistle of shells that would land nearby and those that would sail overhead to targets farther. "Back." "Blood pressure dropping," announced Lieutenant Thomas Wright, the anesthesiologist, his eyes fixed on the primitive monitoring equipment they had available. 90/60 and falling. "I see it," Henderson replied, his voice still maintaining that same professional calm that had steadied countless young surgeons under his tutelage. "He is bleeding from the splenic artery. Mary, I need sutures ready. Tom, push another unit of plasma." Outside the surgical tent, in the receiving area, Captain James Morrison stood waiting for the next wave of casualties. Morrison was a triage officer, a position that required him to make impossible decisions dozens of times each day. He would be the first medical officer to see the wounded as they arrived, and it would be his responsibility to determine who received immediate surgery, who could wait, and who was beyond saving. Morrison had been a small-town doctor in Vermont before the war, treating farming accidents and delivering babies. Nothing in his previous experience had prepared him for what he faced now. Yet, like thousands of other American physicians, he had adapted, learned, and ultimately excelled in this environment of controlled chaos. The sound of an approaching ambulance drew Morrison's attention. The vehicle, a modified jeep with stretcher racks, pulled up to the receiving tent. 2 medics jumped out, their uniforms stained with blood and mud. 2 wounded. One of the medics shouted, his young face showing the strain of having made this run 3 times already that morning. 1 GSW to the chest, 1 partial amputation right leg. Both conscious when we loaded them. Morrison rushed forward, his experienced hands already reaching for the first patient. The soldier, a corporal from Tennessee, had a sucking chest wound, and Morrison could hear the distinctive sound of air being pulled into the thoracic cavity with each laboured breath. Tension pneumothorax, Morrison announced to the nurses, who had rushed to assist him. Get him to pre-op now. Tell Major Henderson we need a chest tube inserted immediately, and this one moves to the front of the line. The second patient, a sergeant from Brooklyn, was conscious but in shock, staring at the ruined remains of his right leg, which had been nearly severed at the knee by machine gun fire. Morrison knelt beside the stretcher, meeting the soldier's terrified eyes. Sergeant, I am Captain Morrison. You are at a surgical hospital. We are going to take care of you. Can you tell me your name? Kowalski, the sergeant gasped through clenched teeth. Sergeant Edward Kowalski. Doc, am I going to lose my leg? Morrison had learned early in his service that lying to wounded men did them no favours. Your leg is badly damaged, Sergeant, but we have excellent surgeons here, and they are going to do everything possible to save it. Right now, I need you to stay calm and let us work. Can you do that for me? The sergeant nodded, and Morrison turned to the nurses. Type and cross-match for surgery. Get him into the pre-op tent. He goes in as soon as we have a table available. As the nurses wheeled both patients away, Morrison took a moment to look around at the organised chaos that surrounded him. 400 yards to the east, German forces were dug in, their artillery within easy range of this hospital. 400 yards to the west, American infantry held their positions, equally capable of accidentally dropping rounds on this location. And yet here, in this impossible middle ground, American military medicine was performing miracles. The decision to place surgical hospitals so close to the front lines had been controversial among American military planners. Traditional military doctrine, based largely on European models and lessons from World War I, held that surgical facilities should be positioned well behind the lines, with wounded men being transported to these safe locations for definitive treatment. But American military surgeons, led by visionaries like Colonel Edward Churchill, the chief surgical consultant to the European theatre, had argued for a different approach. Their reasoning was simple but revolutionary. The sooner a wounded soldier received definitive surgical treatment, the better his chances of survival. Every hour of delay increased the risk of shock, infection, and death. The statistics bore out this reasoning with stark clarity. In World War I, the mortality rate for American soldiers who reached medical treatment had been approximately 8%. In World War II, with forward surgical hospitals like the 45th positioned close to the front lines, that rate had dropped to less than 4%. When measured against the hundreds of thousands of Americans who would be wounded during the war, this difference represented tens of thousands of lives saved. But statistics meant nothing to the men who had to actually implement this strategy. Major Henderson, finishing the surgery on the young private from Iowa, understood the risks intimately. Every person in his hospital, from the surgeons to the nurses to the medics and support staff, was working within range of enemy weapons. One well-placed artillery barrage, one lucky shot from a German bomber, could destroy the entire facility and everyone in it. Closing? Henderson announced, beginning to suture the long abdominal incision he had made. He is going to make it. Nice work, everyone. As the surgical team prepared to transfer their patient to the recovery area, Henderson stripped off his blood-stained gloves and stepped outside the tent for a brief moment of fresh air. The winter cold hit him like a physical blow after the warmth of the surgical tent, but he welcomed it. In the distance, he could hear the constant rumble of artillery, the occasional chatter of machine gun fire, and the deeper boom of tank cannons. Major Henderson, a voice called out. Henderson turned to see Colonel William Patterson, the hospital's commanding officer, approaching through the snow. Patterson was a career military officer who had served in World War I and understood the gravity of their situation better than most. Colonel, Henderson acknowledged, straightening to attention despite his exhaustion. At ease, Major. I wanted to inform you that Division Headquarters has suggested we consider relocating farther back from the front lines. Intelligence indicates the Germans are planning a major push in this sector. Henderson felt his jaw tighten. Sir, with respect, if we move back now, we will be adding 30 minutes to the transport time for every casualty. That is 30 minutes more bleeding, 30 minutes more shock, 30 minutes closer to death for each wounded man. Patterson nodded slowly. I know, Major, and I have already informed Division that we are staying put unless directly ordered to relocate. But I wanted you to be aware of the situation. Make sure your people know they can expect things to get worse before they get better. As if to punctuate the Colonel's words, a series of explosions erupted several hundred yards to the south. Both officers instinctively ducked, then straightened when it became clear the shells were not aimed at their position. They are hitting our supply lines, Patterson observed. The Germans are trying to cut us off, which means we are going to be getting even more casualties soon. Patterson's prediction proved accurate within the hour. By early afternoon, the 45th Surgical Hospital was receiving wounded men at a rate that pushed the facility to its absolute limits. All 3 operating tables were in constant use, with surgeons working in shifts that sometimes stretched for 12 or 16 hours straight. Captain Mary Sullivan, the surgical nurse who had assisted Major Henderson that morning, found herself working her second consecutive shift without break. Her arms ached from holding retractors in place during lengthy procedures. Her feet throbbed from standing on the frozen ground for hours, and her eyes burned from the strain of working under inadequate lighting. Yet she never considered leaving her post. Sullivan had grown up in Boston, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had instilled in her a strong sense of duty and service. She had been one of the first women in her nursing school class to volunteer for military service after Pearl Harbor, driven by a desire to do something meaningful, something that mattered. Now, standing across the operating table from Captain David Chen, a brilliant young surgeon from San Francisco, she watched as he worked to repair a soldier's shattered femur. The injury was catastrophic, the kind that would have resulted in amputation just a generation earlier. But Chen was attempting to save the leg using new techniques in orthopedic surgery that had been developed specifically for combat injuries. I need the bone saw, Chen said, his voice steady despite the complexity of the procedure he was attempting. I am going to have to remove the damaged section of bone and then use a metal rod to bridge the gap. Sullivan handed him the requested instrument, anticipating his next need even before he voiced it. This was the dance they had learned over countless surgeries, a silent communication that came from trust and experience. While Chen worked on the orthopedic case, Major Henderson was 2 tables over, fighting to save a soldier who had taken a direct hit from mortar fire. The young man, barely old enough to shave, had suffered massive trauma to his abdomen and chest. Henderson knew the odds were against them, but he refused to give up. I need more blood, Henderson called out. Tom, is he stabilized enough to continue? Lieutenant Wright checked his instruments and shook his head grimly. His pressure is dropping again, sir. I do not know if he can tolerate much more. Henderson paused, his hands, still inside the soldier's chest cavity, feeling the young heart struggling to beat beneath his fingers. This was the moment he hated most, the moment when medical science reached its limits, and he had to decide whether to continue fighting or to let a patient go peacefully. We keep going, Henderson said quietly. This boy is not dying on my table if I have anything to say about it. For the next 40 minutes, Henderson and his team battled to repair the catastrophic damage. They transfused precious units of whole blood, painstakingly ligated bleeding vessels, removed destroyed sections of bowel, and packed the abdominal cavity with sterile dressings to control hemorrhage they could not directly repair. Finally, exhausted and covered in blood, Henderson stepped back from the table. Close him up, he said to his assistant. Get him to recovery, and watch him like a hawk. If his pressure drops even a point, I want to know immediately. As Henderson stripped off his surgical gown, Captain Morrison appeared at the entrance to the tent. The triage officer's face was grim, and Henderson knew what was coming before Morrison spoke. Sir, we have multiple casualties inbound. Battalion Aid Station reports a direct hit on an American position. They are sending us everyone they cannot handle, which appears to be most of them. Henderson glanced at the surgical tables, where 2 procedures were still ongoing, then looked at the clock mounted on the tent pole. He had been operating for 14 hours straight. His hands were steady for now, but he knew fatigue could make them shake at the worst possible moment. "Get Captain Bradley up here," Henderson ordered, referring to one of the other surgeons who had been resting. "And wake up, Lieutenant Foster. We are going to need every surgeon we have." What Henderson and his team could not have known was that their activities were being observed not just by Captain Weber and Lieutenant Becker, but by higher-ranking German officers who found the American medical deployment both fascinating and disturbing. Major General Karl Heinrich Brenner, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, stood in his command bunker 3 miles behind the German lines, studying reconnaissance reports about American positions. Among the intelligence gathered by his scouts was detailed information about the American field hospital. "They have surgeons operating within our artillery range," Brenner's chief of staff, Colonel Otto Dietrich, reported with evident disbelief. "Our forward observers have confirmed it. They are performing major surgery just 400 meters from the front lines." Brenner, a career officer who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia, found this information difficult to process. In his experience with both the Wehrmacht and the SS, medical facilities were kept well behind the lines, primarily to protect valuable medical personnel, but also because it was assumed that seriously wounded men would die, during long evacuations anyway. "What is the point?" Brenner asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why risk their surgeons and nurses in such an exposed position?" Dietrich consulted his notes. "According to a captured American medical corpsman we interrogated, their doctrine emphasizes rapid surgical intervention. They believe getting wounded men into surgery within 1 or 2 hours significantly improves survival rates." "And does it?" Brenner asked. "Apparently so, sir. The prisoner claimed that American casualties who reach their surgical hospitals have survival rates we would consider impossible. He said something like 95% of wounded who arrive alive at these hospitals survive their injuries." Brenner sat back in his chair, considering the implications. If the Americans could keep more of their wounded soldiers alive, those men could eventually return to combat. Over the course of a long war, this could represent a significant strategic advantage. "Have our artillery target that hospital," Brenner ordered. Dietrich shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it is clearly marked with red crosses. Under the Geneva Convention—" "I am aware of the Geneva Convention, Colonel," Brenner interrupted, "and we will continue to observe it unless we receive orders from higher command to do otherwise. But I want targeting solutions prepared. If the situation deteriorates, and we need to eliminate that position, I want to be ready." Back at the 45th Surgical Hospital, the predicted wave of casualties had arrived, and the facility was overwhelmed. Wounded men lay on stretchers in the receiving area, some crying out in pain, others silent with shock, all waiting their turn for treatment that could mean the difference between life and death. Captain Morrison moved among them with the calm efficiency of a man who had made these terrible calculations hundreds of times before. He would spend a few seconds examining each casualty, checking vital signs, assessing injuries, and then marking them with colored tags that determined their priority for treatment. Red tags meant immediate surgery was needed to save the patient's life. Yellow tags indicated serious injuries that required surgical treatment but could wait a few hours. Green tags were for walking wounded who needed medical care but were not in immediate danger. And black tags, the ones Morrison hated to use but sometimes had no choice, were for those who were too severely injured to save, given the resources available. "Red tag," Morrison said, marking a soldier with a sucking chest wound. "Get him to pre-op now." "Yellow tag," he continued, examining a man with a compound fracture of the forearm. "Clean and splint the wound, pain medication, he can wait for surgery." "Red tag," Morrison said again, looking at a soldier whose abdomen was distended with internal bleeding. "Immediate surgery." And then he came to a young private, no more than 18 years old, who had taken a direct hit from a mortar shell. Morrison's experienced eyes took in the massive head trauma, the absent vital signs, the dilated and fixed pupils. He reached for a black tag, then hesitated. The boy's hand twitched. It might have been a reflex, a random firing of dying neurons, but it might also have been a sign of life. Morrison pressed his fingers against the soldier's neck, feeling for a pulse. There, faint and irregular, but present. Morrison knew he should use the black tag. Resources were limited, and this soldier had injuries that would require hours of surgery with virtually no chance of meaningful survival. The rational choice, the choice that would save more lives overall, was to let this one boy go and use those resources on casualties who had better chances. But Morrison was not just a triage officer. He was a doctor, and doctors fought for every life, no matter how slim the odds. "Red tag," Morrison said, knowing he might be making a mistake but unable to do otherwise. "Get him to Major Henderson immediately. Tell the Major this one needs a neurosurgeon, and we do not have one, but we are going to try anyway." As the nurses rushed the young private toward the surgical tents, Morrison caught the eye of Captain Sullivan, who was transitioning between cases. She looked at the soldier, looked at Morrison, and gave him a small nod that acknowledged what he had done and why. Inside the surgical tent, Major Henderson was between cases, scrubbing his hands in a basin of sterile solution and trying to keep his exhausted mind focused. He had been operating for 18 hours now, with only brief breaks to eat and use the latrine. His back ached, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands had started to develop a fine tremor that worried him. "Major, we have an urgent case coming in," Captain Sullivan announced. "Severe head trauma, penetrating wounds, probably needs neurosurgery." Henderson closed his eyes briefly. He was a general surgeon with some training in trauma care, but neurosurgery was a specialized field, requiring years of additional study. The Army had neurosurgeons, but they were typically stationed at base hospitals farther back from the front lines, not at forward surgical units like this one. "What are his vitals?" Henderson asked. Sullivan read from the chart. Blood pressure 70/40, heart rate 140, respirations 22 and shallow. Pupils fixed and dilated. Those vital signs told Henderson everything he needed to know. This soldier was dying, and without immediate intervention, he would be dead within the hour. But the intervention he needed was beyond Henderson's training and expertise. "Get him on the table," Henderson ordered. "And someone find me any medical text we have on cranial surgery. I am going to need a refresher course, and I am going to need it in about 3 minutes." What happened over the next 6 hours would become one of the legendary stories of the 45th Surgical Hospital, a tale that would be told and retold in medical schools and military hospitals for decades to come. With no formal training in neurosurgery, working from medical textbooks and his own instincts, Major Robert Henderson performed a craniotomy on that young private from Nebraska, relieving the pressure on his brain and removing bone fragments that had been driven into the cerebral cortex. He had no specialized neurosurgical instruments, so he improvised with the tools available. He had no neurosurgical nurse to assist him, so Captain Sullivan learned the procedure as she went, becoming Henderson's hands when his own grew too tired to hold steady. He had no way to monitor intracranial pressure, so he relied on subtle signs and his own judgment to guide him. And somehow, against all odds and all reasonable expectations, the soldier survived. As dawn broke on the 24th of December 1944, the young private was in the recovery tent, still unconscious but alive, his vital signs stabilizing. Major Henderson, finally allowing himself to rest, sat on a camp stool outside the surgical tent, drinking bitter coffee and watching the sun rise over the battlefield. Captain Morrison joined him, equally exhausted from his own night of endless triage decisions. "I heard about the craniotomy," Morrison said quietly. "That was beyond anything I would have attempted." Henderson shrugged. "I did not have a choice. Once he was on my table, he was my responsibility. I could not let him die without trying everything possible. That is why the Germans cannot understand what we are doing here," Morrison observed. "Their military medical system is built on the assumption that some casualties are not worth the effort to save. Ours is built on the assumption that every casualty deserves our best effort, no matter what. Henderson nodded slowly. It is not just a different medical philosophy. It is a different philosophy about the value of human life. We are here, 400 yards from the front lines, because we believe every soldier's life is worth fighting for, worth risking our own lives to save. As if to emphasize his point, a shell whistled overhead, landing somewhere in the distance with a muffled crump. Neither officer flinched. "Do you think we are winning this battle?" Morrison asked. Henderson considered the question. "I think we are winning the only battle that matters to me, which is the battle to keep our boys alive. The rest of it, the grand strategy and the movements of armies, that is for generals to figure out. My war is fought one patient at a time, one surgery at a time." Back in the German lines, Captain Weber and Lieutenant Becker were being relieved from their observation post after a long night of watching the American positions. As they trudged back through the snow toward their own lines, Weber found his thoughts returning to that American field hospital. "They were operating all night," Weber said to Becker. "I could see the lights in. Their surgical tents, never stopping, never dimming. How many men do you think they saved?" Becker shook his head. "I do not know. Dozens, perhaps. Maybe more. We should have shelled that position," Weber said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They are legitimate military targets, medical personnel working in an active combat zone. But we did not," Becker observed. "And we will not. Because even in war, some things remain sacred." What neither German officer knew was that their superiors had indeed prepared targeting solutions for the American field hospital, but orders to fire had never been given. Despite the brutality of the Battle of the Bulge, despite the desperate situation facing German forces, and despite the potential military advantage of destroying that medical facility, the red crosses on those tents had been respected. This unofficial truce regarding medical facilities was not unique to this sector or this battle. Throughout the European theatre of World War II, there was a general understanding among combat forces on both sides that medical personnel and facilities would be spared whenever possible. This was partly due to adherence to the Geneva Conventions, partly due to practical considerations about reciprocal treatment of wounded soldiers, and partly due to a lingering sense of honor among professional military men. But the American practice of positioning surgical hospitals so close to the front lines tested this informal agreement in ways that no one had anticipated. Traditional medical doctrine held that hospital facilities should be positioned well behind the lines, in locations that were clearly non-combatant and therefore unambiguously protected. By placing their surgical units within artillery range of the front, American forces were creating a situation where medical facilities could be struck by indirect fire even if they were not deliberately targeted. Colonel Patterson, the commanding officer of the 45th Surgical Hospital, understood this risk better than most. He had spent the previous evening reviewing casualty reports and logistical updates, trying to calculate how long his unit could sustain its current operational tempo. The numbers were sobering. Since arriving at this position 3 days earlier, the hospital had performed 247 surgeries. They had evacuated 193 patients to rear area hospitals for further treatment or recovery. They had lost 11 patients who had died despite the best efforts of the medical staff, and they had treated countless walking wounded who had been patched up and returned to their units. But the cost of this success was mounting. The hospital's blood supply was running dangerously low. Surgical supplies, especially sutures and antibiotics, were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. And most concerning of all, the medical staff was approaching complete exhaustion. Patterson knew he would soon face a decision. He could request permission to relocate the hospital farther back from the front lines, which would reduce the immediate danger to his personnel, but would also increase the time required to get wounded soldiers into surgery. Or he could keep the hospital where it was, maintaining the rapid treatment times that were saving so many lives, but risking everything and everyone if German forces broke through American lines or if the facility was hit by artillery. As Christmas Eve progressed, the tactical situation in the sector grew increasingly tenuous. German forces, making their last major offensive push of the Battle of the Bulge, were throwing everything they had at American positions. The sound of artillery and small arms fire intensified throughout the day, and the number of casualties arriving at the field hospital increased proportionally. By mid-afternoon, Captain Chen found himself performing his third amputation of the day, a procedure he had hoped to never become routine, but which had become all too familiar. The patient was a sergeant from Texas who had stepped on a German mine, destroying his left foot and lower leg beyond any hope of salvage. "I am sorry, Sergeant," Chen said quietly as he worked. "There is no way to save the leg, but I am going to give you the best stump possible, which will make fitting a prosthetic much easier once you are stateside." The sergeant, sedated but conscious enough to understand what was happening, nodded weakly. "Just do what you got to do, Doc. I just want to go home." As Chen completed the amputation and began closing the wound, he reflected on how much his medical practice had changed since the war began. Before joining the army, he had been working toward a career in academic medicine, planning to split his time between clinical practice and research. The war had transformed him into something different, a surgeon who had performed more trauma procedures in 18 months than most civilian surgeons would see in a lifetime. Across the surgical tent, Major Henderson was dealing with a different kind of trauma case. A young lieutenant had been caught in a building collapse when German artillery had hit an American strongpoint. He had suffered a complex pelvic fracture, along with internal injuries that were difficult to fully assess without better imaging equipment than the field hospital possessed. "I can feel free fluid in the abdomen," Henderson said, his hands carefully palpating the lieutenant's distended belly. "He is bleeding internally, but I cannot tell from where without opening him up. Blood pressure is stable for now," Lieutenant Wright reported from his position at the head of the operating table. "But his hematocrit is dropping, which suggests ongoing hemorrhage." Henderson made his decision. "We are going to do an exploratory laparotomy. Mary, I need a major abdominal surgery set up. We are going in blind, and we need to be ready for anything." For the next 3 hours, Henderson worked to identify and repair the source of the lieutenant's internal bleeding. He found a lacerated liver, a partially severed splenic artery, and a tear in the mesentery that supplied blood to the small intestine. Each injury required meticulous surgical technique to repair, and each repair had to be done quickly to minimize the patient's time under anesthesia. Finally, satisfied that he had controlled all the major bleeding, Henderson began closing the abdominal incision. He was suturing the muscle layer when a tremendous explosion shook the entire facility, causing instruments to rattle off tables and everyone in the tent to instinctively duck. "That was close," Captain Sullivan said, her voice remarkably steady considering a piece of shrapnel had just punched through the canvas wall of the tent, missing her by inches. "Too close," Henderson agreed. "Tom, how is the patient?" "Stable," Wright reported. The explosion did not affect his vital signs. Henderson continued suturing, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system. He had trained himself to compartmentalize fear, to put aside concerns for his own safety while he was responsible for a patient's life. But he could not help wondering if the next shell would land directly on the surgical tent, ending everything in an instant. Outside, Colonel Patterson was surveying the damage from the near miss. The shell, a German 105mm round, had landed in the compound's motor pool, destroying 2 ambulances and wounding 3 of the support personnel. One of the wounded was a driver who had been helping to unload supplies, a corporal from Ohio who had taken shrapnel to his chest and abdomen. "Get him to triage," Patterson ordered the medics who were rushing to help, "and find out if that was a ranging shot or a random round. I need to know if the Germans are deliberately targeting us." Captain Morrison, responding to the new casualty, quickly assessed the wounded driver. The shrapnel wounds were serious but not immediately life-threatening, and Morrison tagged him as a yellow case, someone who needed surgery but could wait until the current crop of red tag emergencies had been handled. "You are going to be fine," Corporal, Morrison assured the wounded man. We will get you into surgery as soon as we have an available table. As Morrison worked, he became aware of Colonel Patterson standing nearby, observing. When Morrison had finished with the initial assessment, Patterson pulled him aside. Captain, I need your honest assessment of our situation, Patterson said quietly. Can we continue operating here, or do we need to relocate? Morrison understood the weight of what Patterson was really asking. As triage officer, Morrison had the best overall view of the casualty flow and treatment capacity. His answer would help determine whether the hospital stayed in its dangerously exposed position or fell, back to greater safety at the cost of increased mortality among the wounded. Sir, we are at our absolute maximum capacity, Morrison replied honestly. Our surgeons are exhausted, our supplies are running low, and we are one direct hit away from catastrophic casualties among our own personnel. But if we relocate now, the increased evacuation time will cost lives. I cannot give you a precise number, but based on what I have seen, I estimate we would lose at least 10 to 15% more casualties if we moved back to a more secure position. Patterson nodded slowly, processing this information. So your recommendation is? We stay, Morrison said firmly. We knew the risks when we set up here. The mission was to save as many lives as possible, and that is what we are doing. Unless we receive direct orders to relocate, or the tactical situation makes our position untenable, I believe we should continue operating where we are. Patterson considered this for a moment, then made his decision. We stay. I will inform Division of our status and request resupply, but we stay. As Christmas Eve turned to Christmas morning, the intensity of combat in the sector began to diminish. Both sides, exhausted from days of intense fighting, seemed to observe an unofficial pause in major offensive operations. The artillery fire decreased to sporadic harassment rather than sustained bombardment, and the flow of casualties to the field hospital slowed to a more manageable level. Major Henderson, finally able to take a longer break, found himself walking through the recovery tent, checking on patients who had passed through his surgical table over the past 36 hours. The young private from Nebraska, the craniotomy case that everyone had expected to die, was showing remarkable progress. He remained unconscious, but his vital signs were stable, and his pupils were beginning to react to light, suggesting that the brain injury might not be as catastrophic as initially feared. Merry Christmas, soldier, Henderson said quietly to the unconscious man. You gave yourself quite a present by staying alive. Moving through the tent, Henderson encountered other patients in various stages of recovery. Some were conscious and talking, their spirits lifted by having survived their injuries. Others remained sedated, fighting battles against infection and shock that would determine whether they lived or died. And a few were clearly dying, their bodies too damaged to repair despite everything the medical staff had done. Henderson stopped beside one of these latter cases, a young corporal who had suffered massive trauma from a direct mortar hit. The soldier was conscious but clearly fading, his breathing laboured and his skin taking on the greyish pallor that Henderson had learned to recognise as the approach of death. Corporal Wilson, Henderson said gently, reading the name from the chart. How are you feeling? Wilson's eyes found Henderson's face, and a weak smile crossed his lips. I have felt better, sir. But I am still here, so I guess that is something. It is indeed something, Henderson agreed. Is there anything I can get for you? Anyone you would like me to write to? My mother, Wilson said softly. Tell her I was thinking of her at the end. Tell her I was not afraid. Henderson felt his throat tighten. He had written dozens of these letters over the past months, and each one was like a small death of his own. But he nodded. I will write to her personally. I promise you that. Wilson nodded and closed his eyes. Henderson stayed with him, holding his hand, until the young corporal's breathing slowed and then stopped. Another life lost. Another family that would receive a telegram and a letter. Another empty space in the world where a vibrant young man had been. As Henderson emerged from the recovery tent, he found Captain Sullivan waiting for him. She had clearly just come from the surgical tent, still wearing her blood-stained surgical gown. "We lost Wilson," Henderson said simply. Sullivan nodded. She had assisted in Wilson's surgery and had known the outcome was inevitable. "We did everything we could for him. It was not enough. It never is," Sullivan said quietly. "But it is all we have to give." They stood together in silence for a moment, two professionals who had been pushed beyond any reasonable limit of endurance, but who continued to function because the alternative was unthinkable. "There is something you should see," Sullivan said finally. "In the surgical tent." A letter came through with one of the casualties. Henderson followed her back to the surgical tent, where she showed him a piece of paper that had been found in the pocket of a wounded German soldier they had treated earlier that day. The soldier, a young private who had been separated from his unit and accidentally walked into American lines before being shot, had been carrying a letter from his mother in Munich. "I do not read German," Henderson said, looking at the neat handwriting. "Lieutenant Fisher does," Sullivan said, referring to one of the army doctors whose parents had immigrated from Germany. "He translated it for us. It is a Christmas letter, telling her son about the family gathering they had planned, about how much they missed him, about hoping the war would be over soon so he could come home." Henderson looked at the letter, then at Sullivan. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because sometimes I need to remember that they are just like us," Sullivan said quietly. "Boys far from home, fighting because they were told to fight, wanting nothing more than to survive and return to their families. We are treating them just the same as our own men, giving them the same care, the same effort, and I wanted you to know that I think that matters. I think it matters a great deal." Henderson folded the letter carefully and handed it back to her. "Make sure that letter gets back to that soldier when he recovers. And yes, you are right. It matters. In the middle of all this death and destruction, maintaining our humanity matters." As Christmas Day continued, the unofficial pause in heavy fighting held. Casualties continued to arrive at the field hospital, but at a reduced rate that allowed the medical staff to catch up on the backlog of yellow tag cases and to perform necessary maintenance on their equipment. Captain Chen took advantage of the lull to perform a surgery he had been putting off, repairing a complex facial injury on a sergeant who had been hit by fragments from an exploding shell. The injury was not life-threatening, but it had left the sergeant with a severe laceration that ran from his forehead, across his left eye, and down to his jaw. "I am going to do my best to minimize scarring," Chen explained to the patient, who was being kept conscious under local anesthesia. "But I have to be honest with you, Sergeant. You are going to have a significant scar. The important thing is preserving function, making sure your eye works and your jaw closes properly." The sergeant, a career soldier from Alabama, managed a weak smile. "Doc, I figure any face I walk away from this war with is better than no face at all. You do what you need to do." Chen worked meticulously, using fine sutures to bring the edges of the wound together as precisely as possible. This was not the kind of surgery that would save a life in the immediate term, but it was the kind that would determine the quality of that life afterward. A soldier who returned home with a barely noticeable scar had a different future than one who returned with a disfiguring injury. In the receiving area, Captain Morrison was taking advantage of the slower pace to review his triage protocols with some of the newer medical corpsmen who had recently joined the hospital. These young men, most of them barely out of high school, would be the ones making initial assessments of casualties in the field, and their decisions would directly impact survival rates. "The most important thing to remember," Morrison told them, "is that triage is not about who deserves treatment. It is not a moral judgment. It is a practical decision about how to save the most lives with limited resources. When you tag someone black, you are not saying they do not matter. You are saying that given the current situation, we cannot save them without sacrificing others who have better chances." One of the corpsmen, a baby-faced private from Kansas, raised his hand. "Sir, how do you live with those decisions? How do you sleep at night knowing you let someone die who might have been saved?" Morrison paused, considering his answer carefully. I sleep at night by knowing that for every one person I tagged black, I saved 3 or 4 others who I tagged red or yellow. I sleep by understanding that in war there are no perfect choices, only less terrible ones. And I sleep by remembering that the alternative to making these hard decisions is chaos, which kills even more people. As the medical staff worked through Christmas Day, they were unaware that their activities continued to be observed by German forces. Captain Weber, back on duty in the observation post, found himself oddly moved by what he was witnessing. He could see American medical personnel emerging from their tents, gathering for what appeared to be a brief Christmas service. Through his binoculars, Weber watched as the Americans bowed their heads in prayer, led by what he assumed was a military chaplain. Even at this distance, even through the lens of the binoculars, Weber could see the exhaustion on their faces, the weight of responsibility they carried, the toll that constant exposure to trauma and death had taken on them. "They are praying," Lieutenant Becker observed, having joined Weber at the observation post. "On Christmas morning, in the middle of a battlefield, they are stopping to pray. So are we," Weber said quietly, thinking of the rushed field service he had attended earlier that morning, conducted in a bunker while artillery rumbled in the distance. So are we. The Christmas service at the 45th Surgical Hospital was indeed brief, conducted by Chaplain Robert Murphy, a Catholic priest from Philadelphia who had volunteered to serve with the forward medical units despite the danger. Murphy kept his remarks short, understanding that these men and women had work to do and that their service to the wounded was itself a form of prayer. "In the Gospel of Luke," Murphy said, his voice carrying across the small gathering, "we read about the birth of Christ in a humble stable, in a place far from comfort and safety. Today, we celebrate that same birth in a place that is equally humble, equally far from comfort and safety. But we celebrate it nonetheless, because the message of Christmas is that hope persists even in the darkest times, that light shines even in the deepest darkness." Major Henderson, standing in the back of the gathering, found himself deeply moved by the chaplain's words. He had not considered himself a particularly religious man before the war, but his experiences over the past 18 months had given him a new appreciation for faith, for the comfort it provided in impossible situations. As the service concluded and the medical staff began to disperse back to their duties, Colonel Patterson approached Henderson. "Major, I have received word from Division Headquarters. They are recommending we prepare to relocate farther back from the front lines. Intelligence suggests the Germans are planning another major push, and our current position may become untenable." Henderson felt a familiar sense of frustration. They had already had this conversation, and he had thought the decision had been made to stay. "Colonel, we have discussed this. Every mile we move back costs lives." "I know," Patterson replied, "and I have already informed Division that we are staying put unless directly ordered to relocate. But I wanted you to be aware that the tactical situation remains fluid. We may not have a choice in the matter." As if to emphasize Patterson's point, the sound of artillery fire suddenly intensified to the east. Both officers turned toward the sound, recognizing the distinctive report of German 88mm guns mixed with the deeper boom of American howitzers responding. "Here we go again," Henderson said quietly. Within minutes, the first casualties from the renewed fighting began to arrive. The brief Christmas respite was over, and the 45th Surgical Hospital was once again in the business of trying to save lives faster than war could destroy them. The next 72 hours would be remembered by everyone who served at the hospital as the most intense period of the entire war. Casualties arrived in a seemingly endless stream, overwhelming every resource the facility possessed. Surgeons operated until they could barely stand, took brief naps on the floor beside their operating tables, and then returned to work. Nurses and corpsmen pushed themselves beyond exhaustion, running on nothing but adrenaline and determination. Captain Sullivan found herself assisting in a surgery where she had to physically hold Major Henderson upright when he began to sway from exhaustion. Captain Chen operated with hands that trembled from fatigue, but somehow remained steady enough to perform delicate vascular repairs. Lieutenant Wright pushed himself to monitor 3 surgical cases simultaneously, running between operating tables to check vitals and adjust anesthesia. And through it all, Captain Morrison stood in the receiving area, making his impossible decisions, tagging casualties with colors that meant life or death, trying to save everyone, while knowing he could only save some. On the 3rd day of this brutal period, the 28th of December, 1944, the tactical situation in the sector reached a crisis point. German forces, making their final desperate push in the Battle of the Bulge, broke through American lines just 300 yards from the field hospital's position. Colonel Patterson, receiving urgent reports from division headquarters, made the decision he had been dreading. We evacuate. Now. Begin loading patients immediately. Priority goes to those who can be safely moved. Critical cases that cannot survive transport stay with a skeleton medical crew until we can arrange for their evacuation later. The next hour was controlled chaos as the hospital staff worked to evacuate as many patients as possible. Ambulances and trucks were loaded with wounded men, with the most stable patients being transported first. Medical equipment was hastily packed, with essential supplies taking priority over everything else. Major Henderson faced a terrible decision. He had 3 patients on operating tables, all in critical condition, all in the middle of surgeries that could not be safely interrupted. Moving these men now would almost certainly kill them. But staying behind to finish their surgeries meant that Henderson and his surgical teams would be at risk of being overrun by German forces. Colonel, Henderson said to Patterson, his voice calm but firm, I need 90 minutes to finish these cases. I cannot move these patients until their surgeries are complete. Patterson looked at the tactical map, calculating distances and advance rates. Major, I cannot guarantee we will have 90 minutes. German forces could be here in half that time. Then they will find me operating. Henderson replied simply. I am not abandoning these patients. Captain Sullivan, Lieutenant Wright, you are both free to evacuate with the rest of the unit. I will not order you to stay. Sullivan and Wright exchanged glances, then Sullivan spoke for both of them. With respect, sir, we are not leaving either. These patients need a full surgical team, and that is what they are going to get. Patterson studied the 3 medical officers, recognizing the determination in their eyes. Finally, he nodded. I will leave you 1 ambulance and a squad of infantry for security. You have your 90 minutes, Major. Make them count. As the main body of the hospital evacuated, Henderson and his skeleton crew continued to operate. They could hear the sound of combat drawing closer, the distinctive chatter of American M1 Garands mixing with the slower rate of German Mauser rifles. Occasionally, a stray bullet would crack through the air overhead, a reminder of how close the fighting had come. In the German lines, Captain Weber was advancing with his company as part of the breakthrough force. As they approached the American positions, he recognized the location of the field hospital he had been observing for days. The hospital is still there, he reported to his company commander over the radio. I can see their tents. Some of them appear to still be occupied. Continue. The advance, came the response. Do not engage medical facilities unless they resist. Weber's company pushed forward, clearing American positions and taking prisoners. As they drew within 100 yards of the hospital, Weber could see through his binoculars that the facility had been largely evacuated. But in one tent, he could clearly see the lights still burning and figures moving inside. Someone is still operating, Weber said in disbelief. They are still performing surgery. Inside that tent, Major Henderson was closing the abdomen of his last patient, a young corporal who had suffered a ruptured spleen and liver laceration. The surgery had been complicated by the patient's poor condition and the limited blood supply remaining at the hospital, but Henderson had managed to control the bleeding and repair the damage. Closing now, Henderson announced, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Tom, how is he? Stable, Wright replied. Blood pressure is holding, heart rate is coming down. I think he is going to make it. As Henderson placed the last suture, he became aware of voices outside the tent, speaking in German. For a moment, his hands paused in their work, then he resumed suturing. Whatever was about to happen would happen, but he would finish this surgery first. Captain Weber pushed aside the tent flap and entered the surgical area, his Luger pistol drawn but pointed at the floor. He stopped, taking in the scene before him. 3 American medical officers, covered in blood and clearly exhausted, working to save the life of an American soldier. Henderson glanced up at the German officer, met his eyes, then returned his attention to his patient. "I am almost finished," he said in English, not knowing if the German would understand. "Then you can take us prisoner." Weber, who had studied English in university before the war, understood perfectly. For a long moment, he stood there, his pistol in his hand, watching as Henderson tied off the final suture and stepped back from the table. "We need to transfer him to a litter," Henderson said to Sullivan and Wright. "Carefully, support his abdomen during the move." Only when the patient had been safely transferred and his vital signs checked one final time did Henderson turn to face Weber. He stripped off his surgical gloves and gown, standing in his blood-stained surgical scrubs, and raised his hands. "Major Robert Henderson, United States Army Medical Corps. These are my colleagues, Captain Mary Sullivan and Lieutenant Thomas Wright. We are non-combatants under the Geneva Convention, and we claim the protection afforded to medical personnel." Weber slowly holstered his pistol. "Captain Friedrich Weber, Wehrmacht. You are prisoners of war. You and your patients will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." What happened next would become one of the small miracles that occasionally occurred even in the midst of war's brutality. Weber, acting on his own authority and risking severe punishment if his superiors discovered what he had done, arranged for Henderson, Sullivan, Wright, and their 3 critical patients to be transported under guard back to American lines under a flag of truce. "I am a soldier," Weber explained in halting English as he escorted Henderson to the waiting ambulance. "I have killed many men, and many have tried to kill me, but I am not a monster. You stayed behind to save lives, at great risk to your own safety. This deserves respect, even from an enemy." Henderson, exhausted beyond words, could only nod his thanks. As the ambulance carrying the American medical personnel and their patients moved slowly back toward American lines, Henderson looked back at the field hospital that had been his home and workplace for the past weeks. The tents still stood, marked with their red crosses, a small island of mercy in an ocean of violence. The 45th Surgical Hospital would be re-established 3 miles farther back from the front lines, still close enough to provide rapid surgical intervention, but far enough back to be out of immediate danger from German ground forces. The hospital would continue to operate throughout the Battle of the Bulge and beyond, treating thousands of casualties and saving countless lives. Major Henderson would return to duty after a brief rest, continuing to perform miracles of surgery under impossible conditions. Captain Sullivan would eventually be awarded the Bronze Star for her service, one of the few nurses to receive such recognition. Lieutenant Wright would survive the war and return to civilian practice, carrying with him the skills and experiences that would make him one of the premier anesthesiologists of his generation. And Captain Morrison would continue his lonely work in the receiving area, making his impossible decisions, bearing the weight of every life he could not save, finding solace in those he could. The Battle of the Bulge would eventually turn in favor of the Allied forces, with German forces being pushed back and the crisis passing. But the lessons learned by the 45th Surgical Hospital and other forward medical units would persist long after the war ended. The concept of forward surgical hospitals, positioned close to the front lines to provide rapid, definitive treatment, would become a cornerstone of American military medicine. In Korea, MASH units would operate on similar principles, saving thousands of lives. In Vietnam, the Golden Hour concept would emphasize getting wounded soldiers into surgery within 60 minutes of injury. And in modern conflicts, forward surgical teams would continue the tradition established by units like the 45th, bringing advanced medical care to the very edge of the battlefield. But beyond the tactical and medical innovations, there was a deeper significance to what those American medical personnel had done. By positioning their hospitals 400 yards from the front lines, by refusing to abandon their patients even when enemy forces were overrunning their positions, by treating every casualty with the same dedication regardless of nationality, they had made a profound statement about the value of human life. Captain Weber, who survived the war and returned to Germany, would later write in his memoirs about that Christmas season in the Ardennes. He would describe his amazement at the American Field Hospital, his respect for the medical personnel who staffed it, and his belief that their dedication to saving lives represented something fundamentally important about the American character. They could have positioned their hospitals in safe areas behind their lines, Weber wrote. They could have prioritized the safety of their medical personnel over the lives of their wounded soldiers, but they chose differently. They chose to risk everything to save everyone they could. This, I came to understand, was what made them different from us. Not superior weapons or greater numbers, but a fundamental belief that every individual life mattered, that every soldier deserved the best possible chance to survive. For the men who had been treated at the 45th Surgical Hospital, who had been carried on stretchers into those canvas tents and emerged alive, thanks to the skill and dedication of the medical staff, the experience left a lasting impact. Many would later speak of their gratitude, not just for the medical treatment they received, but for the care and compassion shown to them in their darkest hours. One patient, the young private from Nebraska who had survived Major Henderson's improvised craniotomy, would eventually recover almost completely from his head injury. He would return to the United States, complete his education on the GI Bill, and become a physician himself, inspired by the doctor who had refused to give up on him even when the situation seemed hopeless. The sergeant from Brooklyn who had lost his leg would be fitted with a prosthetic and would walk again, eventually opening a small business in his hometown and raising a family. He would keep in his desk drawer a faded photograph of the 45th Surgical Hospital, a reminder of the place where his life had been saved and his future had been made possible. And the young lieutenant with the complex pelvic fracture would make a full recovery, return to active duty, and eventually retire as a colonel, never forgetting the surgical team that had spent hours repairing his shattered body with skill and determination. These were the victories that mattered to the medical personnel of the 45th Surgical Hospital, not the strategic objectives captured or the enemy forces defeated, but the individual lives saved, the young men sent home to their families, the futures made possible by their dedication. As Major Henderson would later reflect in a letter to his wife, written in the quiet days after the Battle of the Bulge had ended and the hospital had moved to a more secure position, "We are not here to win the war. We are here to make sure that when the war is won, there are enough of our boys left alive to enjoy the peace. Every surgery I perform, every patient who survives, is my small contribution to that goal. And, in the end, I think that matters more than all the medals and commendations in the world." The story of the American field hospitals positioned 400 yards from the front lines is ultimately a story about courage, not the courage of soldiers charging into battle, but the courage of medical personnel who chose to put themselves in harm's way to save others. It is a story about innovation, about questioning traditional military doctrine and finding better ways to preserve life. And it is a story about the fundamental values that defined the American war effort, the belief that every individual mattered and deserved the best possible chance to survive. The German soldiers who observed these hospitals, who watched in amazement as American surgeons operated within range of artillery fire, who witnessed the dedication of nurses and medics working under impossible conditions, came away with a new understanding of their enemy. They might not have agreed with American political aims or military strategy, but they could not help but respect the commitment to preserving life that these forward hospitals represented. In the decades after World War II, as military medicine continued to evolve and improve, the experiences of units like the 45th Surgical Hospital would be studied and analysed, their successes replicated and their challenges addressed. But the fundamental principle they established, that medical care should be brought as close to the battlefield as possible to maximize survival rates, would remain a cornerstone of military medical doctrine. Today, when modern military medical units deploy to combat zones, they carry with them the legacy of those pioneering field hospitals of World War II. The equipment is more advanced, the techniques more refined, the survival rates even higher, but the commitment remains the same: to save every life possible, to give every wounded soldier the best chance to survive, to maintain the value and dignity of each individual, even in the chaos and brutality of war. The story of German troops who could not believe American field hospitals performed surgery 400 yards from the front is more than just a historical curiosity or a tale of medical innovation. It is a reminder of what it means to maintain humanity in the midst of inhumanity, to preserve civilization's values, even when civilization itself seems to be tearing apart. Those canvas tents, marked with red crosses, positioned in the frozen mud of the Ardennes forest within sight and sound of combat, represented something profound. They were not just medical facilities, but symbols of hope, tangible proof that even in war, even when nations committed all their resources to destroying each other, there remained a fundamental recognition of the value of human life. Major Henderson, Captain Sullivan, Lieutenant Wright, Captain Morrison, Captain Chen, and all the other medical personnel who served in those forward hospitals knew this, even if they could not always articulate it. They knew that what they were doing mattered in ways that transcended the immediate tactical situation. They were not just treating wounds and saving lives, they were affirming the values that made their society worth defending. And perhaps this, more than anything else, is what the German soldiers found so difficult to believe. Not just the medical capabilities or the willingness to take risks, but the fundamental commitment to the value of each individual life that the forward placement of these hospitals represented. In a war that had already claimed millions of lives and would claim millions more, in a conflict that had descended into industrial-scale slaughter, these small medical units positioned 400 yards from the front lines stood as reminders that every life still mattered, that every wounded soldier deserved the best possible chance to survive. The legacy of these hospitals extends beyond military medicine, beyond tactical innovations, beyond the thousands of individual lives they saved. It speaks to something essential about the American character, about a society's commitment to its citizens, about the value placed on each individual regardless of rank or circumstance. When Captain Weber watched those American medical tents through his binoculars, when he observed surgeons operating under fire, when he finally met Major Henderson and chose to return him and his patients to American lines rather than taking them prisoner, he was witnessing more than just a different approach to military medicine. He was seeing a different philosophy about the value of human life, a different set of priorities about what mattered most. This is why the story of American Field, hospitals operating 400 yards from the front lines, continues to resonate decades after the events themselves. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when survival itself is uncertain, there are those who will risk everything to preserve life and maintain humanity. The surgeons, nurses, medics, and support personnel who staffed these hospitals did not think of themselves as heroes. They were simply doing their jobs, treating patients, performing surgeries, saving lives when they could, and providing comfort when they could not. But in choosing to do those jobs under conditions of extreme danger, in refusing to prioritize their own safety over the lives of their patients, in maintaining the highest standards of medical care, even when easier options were available, they demonstrated a kind of moral courage that deserves to be remembered and honored. The wounded soldiers who passed through those field hospitals, who were carried into surgical tents on stretchers and emerged alive, thanks to the skill and dedication of the medical staff, never forgot what had been done for them. They carried the memory of that care for the rest of their lives, and many passed those stories on to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that the legacy of the forward field hospitals would continue for generations. As the last survivors of World War II pass away, and the conflict transitions from living memory to history, stories like this become increasingly important. They remind us of what was sacrificed, what was accomplished, and what values guided those sacrifices and accomplishments. The American field hospitals, positioned 400 yards from the front lines, were not perfect. They faced supply shortages, equipment failures, personnel exhaustion, and all the other challenges of operating in a combat zone. But they persevered, they adapted, they innovated, and they saved lives. This is their story, the story of medical personnel refused to accept traditional limitations, who insisted that every soldier deserved the best possible chance to survive, who put themselves at risk to preserve others. It is a story worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth passing on to future generations as an example of courage, dedication, and the fundamental value of human life.